still remember a sermon that was delivered here by my colleague, the Reverend Tamara Labach, in which she asked us to think about or recall our greatest mistake, our biggest moral failure, the moment that we are most ashamed about, and then to imagine that the video screen were to come down and play for all to see that moment of our greatest shame. That's one of those sermon illustrations that if you really follow along, you never forget it. As I recall, the sermon was about us being more than the worst thing we'd ever done. It's easy to define ourselves and each other by one act or one characteristic or one failure, and yet our lives are about so much more than any one thing that we've done or one aspect of our lives. I mean, we might ask, is John McCain or Hillary Clinton defined most as losers of their race for the presidency, or defined by all the incredible years of service that they've given to our country? More pointedly, should Bill Clinton be defined by having cheated on his spouse and then lying about it to the American people and being impeached, or for the many accomplishments that he's had? Do our failures or our character flaws define us? Is our life like a chain in that it is only as good as its weakest link? Or is it more like a rope that's woven together many, many strands, so that if one strand or even a few strands are broken or bad, the rope still has value? These questions came to mind because of our anthem this morning. They did a great job, by the way. Rick Fortner is away, and Janet Allen was leading the choir, and you all did a fantastic job. Thank you. Thank you. These words come from Thomas Jefferson. The God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time. Now, these are certainly appropriate words for a great American revolutionary. They seem like natural sentiments from a man who penned the Declaration of Independence. But the words seem troubling coming from the mouth of a person who was a slaveholder his entire life. The God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time, he wrote. Now, if we assume that Jefferson believed these words, then we have to believe that he was deeply and morally conflicted, because he knew what he was doing was immoral, was ungodly in his words, and yet he could not or would not stop doing it. We often hear the argument that a person is a product of his or her times, and that we should not judge them by the standards and the morals of our own times. There's a lot of merit in this idea. Imagine that you're an oncologist today, and you might be. You prescribe radiation to people who are battling cancer. Now, if 100 years from now, we learn that radiating people was actually a harmful and awful practice, would we be right to blame and shame the doctors who, in their time, truly believed that they were doing what was right? Or 100 years from now, we learn that fossil fuels destroyed life and nature as we know it on this planet, yet we all drive cars and fly in airplanes. Would it be right to take our name off a building at a university that honored us for some other achievement? But Jefferson does not fall easily into this category, because he knew and he believed what he was doing was profoundly morally wrong, and yet he kept doing it. But Jefferson also gave us the Declaration of Independence. a document that has inspired freedom both here and abroad for generations. Should we define him by his slaveholding, his moral cowardice, his expediency, or by his legacy of political freedom? Probably both, probably all of those things. Neither should completely overshadow the others. It's wrong to let the fact that he was less than perfect and had moral failings and character defects and was a man of his times in many ways to keep us from honoring his legacy for good. Now, when I told the worship team this week that I was going to be speaking on this subject, they told me that everyone listening is going to think I'm trying to defend Donald Trump. Now, I don't know why they think that, because that's not at all what I was thinking about or am thinking about as the point of this message. I was not even considering our current president as I developed this sermon. The person I was thinking about besides Jefferson was one of the co-founders of this church, Mr. Richard Lloyd Jones. He was the son of a well-known and prolific Unitarian minister, Reverend Jenkins Lloyd Jones, who fought in the Civil War for the North, and he founded All Souls Church in Chicago. In fact, we have Reverend Jenkins Lloyd Jones' ministerial robe and the buttons from his Civil War uniform and some of his books on display in a case outside of our chapel down in the children's wing of the church. The good Reverend's son, Richard, however, was different in many ways from his father. He came to Tulsa and he became the owner of the Tulsa Tribune newspaper. This was in the early part of the last century and was during a period considered by many historians to be one of the lowest and worst points of black-white relations in our country. From about 1917 to 1923, this country saw some of the worst race violence perpetrated by white people against African Americans outside of slavery itself. This was a time marked by gruesome lynchings and race riots and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, a race riot back then was when white people went into a black section of the community and they killed black people and destroyed and looted their property. Today we would more aptly refer to this as domestic terrorism or a massacre. When it happened to the Jews in Europe throughout history, it was called a pogrom. It began with the East St. Louis riots of 1917. White rioters killed an estimated 100 black residents. That same year, there were similar mass murders of African Americans by white people in Chester, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and Houston, which was followed by what's known as the Red Summer of 1919, when race riots of whites decimating black communities and killing people in huge numbers happened in Washington, D.C., Chicago, Omaha, Charleston, South Carolina, Longview, Texas, Knoxville, Tennessee, and Elaine, Arkansas. 1920 saw a similarly awful riots in Ocoee, Florida, and West Frankfort, Illinois, followed by Tulsa in 1921, said to be the largest and deadliest of them all. And then Rosewood, Florida in 1923. The Ku Klux Klan was a major force in Tulsa at the time, and most white leaders, including politicians and judges and business owners, were members of the Klan. Mr. Jones wrote editorials in his newspaper that spoke unapologetically to these prejudices and inflamed and amplified the ideas of white supremacy that were so toxic and deadly and prevalent in those times. In 1921, the same year that Jones helped establish All Souls as a progressive religious community in Tulsa, he was also pouring fuel on the flames of racial discord that were burning throughout this city. This month, in the spring issue of the UU World magazine, our national Unitarian Universalist magazine, that will arrive in mailboxes in the next week or so. You should get a copy if you're a member of the church. If you don't, let us know. There will be a cover article on race in America that tells the story of Tulsa and of All Souls. They say they've given more print to this article than any in the history of the magazine. It's an honest article, and it lifts up how Unitarian Universalists over the years have both promoted as well as helped to dismantle white supremacy and racism. It reminds us that a person can be religiously progressive, but that does not automatically mean that person is just or ethical or even moral. Just as a person can be a Christian, that doesn't automatically mean that that person is ethical or just. So they sent me a preview copy of the article, and I can tell you they don't shy away from telling the story of Richard Lloyd Jones as it relates to the Tulsa race riot. But they also talk about how in 1960, a young Reverend John Burton Wolfe came to town to become the senior minister of this church, and how he became one of the chief white leaders of the civil rights movement in Tulsa, and how over the past 6 decades, All Souls has become a recognized force for racial justice in this community. Today we have a vision that's printed and hung on the wall in our foyer and is in cards in the back of every pew in this sanctuary and posted in other places on our website that says that by 2021, the centennial of this church and the centennial of the race riot here in Tulsa, we aim to be a church that is a welcoming home for all people and a recognized source of social and environmental justice in this community. Mr. Jones, through his writing and his paper, took on many important causes for the good of this city. But he also played an oversized role in naming and shaping the attitudes out of which our city and our country's worst race massacre occurred. At the very same time, he was helping to establish a church that would one day become a significant force for racial justice and healing. Someone once told me that in nature, wherever there's a poison plant growing somewhere within a certain radius, you can also find the antidote to that poison. Mr. Jones' legacy in this city includes that he was among those of his generation whose outspoken prejudices led to profound suffering and death and contributed to a tragedy and an injustice from which our city is still trying to heal. Yet his legacy also included building a church that would one day become part of the antidote to that poison. When I think of the stories of people like Jefferson and Jones, I'm reminded how complex every life and every person is. In our hearts, I believe most people are striving to do good and to avoid harm. But even the best of us fall short, have our failings, and are influenced by our culture and our times. When I remember that with humility, it helps me to hold the whole person that's in front of me or the whole person from history. We have a Manichaean tendency in our culture to divide people and to divide our world into good and bad, dark and light, cowboys and Indians, police and gangsters, sinners and saints. Reality, however, is much more complex, much more layered and interwoven. And the good news in all this is to remember that so are we. Not only can we look at people in our lives who we could define by one part of their story as a thief or a crook or a drunk or a drug addict or a convict or a cheat, but we can also see them more fully and more holistically. We can also honor their contributions and the value and worth that they bring. Maybe more importantly, we can remember that it's true for us, for you, and for me as well. Our lives are not like a chain. where each individual link or action has to stand on its own as if the entire worth is only as good as the weakest part. Our lives are like intricately woven rope. There may be torn or broken strands here and there. A rope is made of many different strands so that even if some are broken, and even broken, different ones are broken in different places throughout its length, the rope is still usable and still strong. I don't think any one of us would want the moment that we are least proud of to be displayed on a video before the crowd. I know I wouldn't. I suppose that's what Jesus meant when he told the people who were gathered in the temple, ready to stone to death the woman who had committed adultery, "Let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone." It says in the story, one by one, the people all dropped their stones and walked away. His advice to the woman was to go and sin no more. The message to her and to us: you are forgiven. We all make mistakes. We all miss the mark sometimes. The more power and influence that we have, the more our mistakes are amplified. No matter what you've done or failed to do, you are forgiven. At least forgiven in the sense that you are not defined by your mistake or your mistakes. You are a whole person whose life is made of many parts woven together like a rope, and what matters most is not what was done or what is broken, but what is possible going forward. Go and forgive as you have been forgiven. Go and be free and look to the future. The God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time. Amen.